French.
You can speak in French. I know, because you don't like to, be on camera. Welcome, Representative Michelle. Oh, great. What a wonderful crowd so far. And feel free to introduce yourself. Thank you. Oh, CTLCV. Yes, Juliana is our new representative with CTLCV. Welcome. Hello, Derek. Sustainable Rocky Hill. Sounds lovely. All right. Well, let me put my stuff in there.
Oh, there you are, Martha. You got on. Good. Great. Excellent. I'm watching for anybody with technical problems, but you're not the people that are going to be having the technical problems, I guess. So.
I'm going to give it people 2 more minutes. Yeah. Welcome, Tom Metzner, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Thank you for coming. All right. Hello from Waterbury Public Works. Excellent. Ian, apples off the tree. Sounds like a good idea to me. Sharon Energy and Environmental Commission. This is wonderful. I'm so glad that everybody has come to join us today. Kevin will get started in a moment. Welcome, Diane, Sustainability Liaison, Food Rescue USA, butternut squash soup. Yeah. I got a couple of these little bitty butternut squashes that I like to make into like mash that I got from my CSA. Oh, hi, Fran. Nice to see you again. All right. I got 2 more people in.
Oops.
And all right, so let's get started. It's 12:04. If you want, Susan, if you keep an eye on for me, if you just keep an eye on people coming in, you can let them in.
I will. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Everybody is welcome here. My name is Ann Gadwa. I'm the Advocacy and Outreach Organizer with Sierra Club Connecticut and a member of the Zero Waste Coalition. The Zero Waste Coalition was started by Sharon Lewis of Connecticut Environmental and Economic Justice, Connecticut Coalition for Environmental and Economic Justice, excuse me, a couple of years ago to address the looming waste crisis in our state and to find sustainable and equitable and solutions to our waste problems here in Connecticut. So welcome to the Advanced Recycling and an Equitable and False Solution webinar. Unfortunately, Sharon Lewis is unable to join with us this afternoon due to some unforeseen circumstances. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of the webinar and the topic, and then I'll hand it over to Kevin Boudreaux. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping points. This is being recorded. So if you, want to stay off camera, however you see fit to be recorded, then that is up to you. Just wanted to let you know. We have plenty of time for a question and answer period at the end, so please save your questions till after Kevin presents. Once Kevin starts, please minimize the conversation in the chat. It's distracting to the presenter, and if we have questions or if you want to make a comment, we can save it for after. We should be able to get to everybody. If you do have a question after during the question and answer period, you can raise your hand. If you're uncomfortable with talking, you can also use the chat then. And we'll get to as many as we can. Sound good? Does anyone have any questions on that before we get going? All right. So as many of you are aware, we are facing a bit of a waste crisis here in Connecticut and have been for a lot of years. And unfortunately, our past solution for waste management has been waste incineration. And this has come with a terrible cost to the communities where these facilities are located. The majority of the state's waste was, until recently, incinerated in either the Hartford Mira plant or the Bridgeport facility. Both of these cities are environmental justice communities, both are low-income communities, and both are majority in Black and Brown communities. The ash from this waste has gone to the Putnam Ash Landfill in Eastern Connecticut, which is also an environmental justice community. Particulate matter and air pollution from these facilities has contributed to increased asthma and respiratory disease rates, raising illnesses and hospitalizations, and decreasing the quality of life there. And unfortunately, it is a very common story in Connecticut that EJ communities bear the majority of the burden of pollution for the rest of the state. So in July, the Mira plant was closed, and we're now faced with what to do with a substantial amount of the waste that is produced in the state, and now that it's no longer going to Hartford. There are going to be many solutions presented that may or may not be the best answers. And one of these solutions presented is advanced or chemical recycling. So we're now going to hear from Kevin Boudris, Senior Counsel and Program Director at Just Zero. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Anne, and thank you to all of you for being here today to discuss a really important and timely topic, that is advanced recycling, and the concerns that many of us have, not only about this false solution that's being presented as an answer to the waste crisis, but more importantly, some of the really problematic and insidious ways that false solutions like advanced recycling are being pushed, particularly on environmental justice communities. If you give me just a moment, I will share my screen and get going. Zach, can I get a thumbs up if folks can see the slides? All right, thanks, Anne. So as Anne mentioned, my name is Kevin Boudris, and I'm Senior Counsel and Program Director at Just Zero. And before I get going here on advanced recycling, I'd just like to say a few words about Just Zero, because we are a new nonprofit that's focused exclusively on addressing our waste crisis throughout the country. We work alongside communities, policymakers, scientists, educators, organizers, and others to implement just and equitable solutions to our waste crisis. At Just Zero, we believe that everyone deserves zero waste solutions with zero climate damaging emissions and zero toxic exposures. And it's that vision, our vision, that everyone in this world, everyone in this country deserves zero waste solutions with zero climate damaging emissions and zero toxic exposures, that really informs our concerns and ultimately our opposition to false solutions like so-called advanced recycling. And again, in particular, some of the really problematic ways that so-called advanced recycling is being pushed on states and on communities. So today in my presentation, I'd first like to go through what is advanced recycling, because it's actually kind of a complicated topic, a complicated question. I'm also going to review the industry lobbying campaign behind this push for so-called advanced recycling. We're really going to cover who's pushing for it, how are they pushing for advanced recycling, and why are they pushing for advanced recycling. And lastly, I'm going to touch on the really stark and problematic connection between so-called advanced recycling technologies and environmental injustice. So first up, what is advanced recycling? And as I mentioned, this is a complicated topic because the petrochemical industry, one of the major proponents of advanced recycling, likes to present a version, a futuristic myth around advanced recycling that just doesn't match with reality. And that's one of the things that I'm really going to try to tackle here in my remarks about what advanced recycling is. Because at the end of the day, so-called advanced recycling and so-called chemical recycling are really just public relations for plastics. They are greenwashed phrases that are intended to present this rosy vision of what in reality are highly problematic technologies. And the reason that they're being pushed by the petrochemical industry is that the intent here is to distract from, delay, and derail real reforms around plastics manufacturing and plastics consumption. As many of you on this Zoom webinar today know, plastics are a real problem. Plastics production is a problem. It's toxic and climate damaging. Plastic disposal is a problem. The fact that there are all of these plastics in our lives leaching toxics into our food and our other products is a problem. And the petrochemical industry makes a lot of money off of plastics. They rely on this continued pipeline of turning fossil fuels into plastics and selling those plastics to the public to make their profits. And they want to keep on doing so. And so they've presented this idea of so-called advanced recycling as a supposed answer to all of our concerns around all of this plastic waste in our lives. It's a hand-wavy smokescreen to distract us from the real problem, which is that we're just making so much plastic in the first place. The petrochemical industry and the packaging industries intend advanced recycling, in theory, to be an umbrella term that refers to a number of different types of technologies. So-called advanced recycling, it's not just one thing. It's not just one type of facility. It's not just one type of technology. It includes a number of different technologies in its theoretical umbrella, including things like gasification, pyrolysis, solvolysis, methanolysis, hydrolysis, and depolymerization. All of these technologies, and this is not an exhaustive list, but all of these technologies that fall under this theoretical umbrella use heat and sometimes solvents to break down plastics. The again, theoretical idea, and I'm using the word theoretical because what happens in theory doesn't match what happens in reality, and I'll get into that in a second. But in this theoretical umbrella, all of these technologies are intended to break down plastics into things like hydrocarbons and monomers, which are the building blocks of plastics, so-called chemical feedstocks and fuels and other waste byproducts. And there are two big reasons that the petrochemical industry likes to use the phrase advanced recycling to refer to this whole suite of different types of high heat plastics technologies. The first is that they think advanced recycling sounds good. As I mentioned earlier, this is a piece of greenwashing. Advanced recycling, it sounds like some futuristic solution to our problem. It sounds advanced, which it's not, and it sounds like recycling, which it's not. And I'll get into in a bit the reasons why, in fact, it doesn't result in any real recycling. But it's a phrase that sounds good. Gasification and pyrolysis are things that people are increasingly understanding to be toxic and problematic. So they don't want to say gasification and pyrolysis. They want to say advanced recycling. The other reason that the industry likes to use this broad umbrella term is that they like to lump all of these technologies together. Because often when the petrochemical industry is selling us this futuristic vision of what so-called advanced recycling can be, they're talking about certain types of depolymerization technologies that are only being studied at a lab scale, that maybe, according to industry-funded studies, show a little bit of promise in breaking down plastics. So they like to talk about that rosy futuristic vision, but they want to lump that vision in with all of the types of facilities that are currently operating, because they can talk about this myth of what advanced recycling can be without having to acknowledge what it really is on the ground in practice right now in this country. Because what these so-called advanced recycling technologies are on the ground does not match up with this myth, with this futuristic vision being peddled by the petrochemical industry. Because in reality, most, if not all, advanced recycling facilities currently operating at industrial scale in the US are using either gasification or pyrolysis. All of these facilities are generating plastic-derived fuel, which ends up being burned, and toxic waste products, which also end up being burned. And this process in total emits toxics and climate-damaging gases. That's the reality of advanced recycling in practice as it exists right now in the country, and the industry wants to avoid having to acknowledge that reality. Right now in the US, there are 6 so-called advanced recycling facilities operating and taking in waste plastic. I've listed these facilities here. Every single one of these facilities actually right now is using a pyrolysis process. They're not using salicylisis. They're not using some futuristic version of depolymerization. They're using high heat pyrolysis processes to generate fuel and toxic chemicals. That's it. And when we take a deeper look at what in practice these pyrolysis processes represent, they really are plastics incineration broken into two steps. Now, the petrochemical industry likes to go on and on about how advanced recycling is not burning, it's not incineration, it's not incineration. But again, if we ignore the futuristic vision, if we ignore the lab studies and we look at what's actually happening right now in these facilities, they are doing something that is incineration broken into two steps. Step one, these facilities take plastics and they heat them in a limited oxygen environment to essentially melt and boil those plastics down into those things that I mentioned earlier: hydrocarbons, monomers, chemicals, and waste byproducts. And then step two is important. The industry likes to ignore step two. But in step two, everything that comes out of step one, except for some of the solid waste products, but all of the hydrocarbons, the monomers, the fuels, the chemicals, all of that ends up being burned. That's incineration split into two steps. Sure, you've done it in two different parts, but at the end of the day, you brought plastics in and you ended up burning them. That's a problem. Now, I'm going to take a closer look at two of the facilities that are on that list of 6 to just illustrate the disconnect between the industry myths and the reality of what's going on in these facilities. And the first facility that I'm going to highlight is a Brightmark facility in Ashley, Indiana. So this Brightmark facility is often held up by the industry as a gold standard. Look at what Brightmark is doing. It's a pyrolysis facility that takes in waste plastic, and industry proponents like to say that this facility creates waxes and lubricants, and they're working on closing the loop on plastics and turning the end monomers that come out back into plastics. Again, this is the myth of what they say advanced recycling can be. But the reality of what's happening at Brightmark is very, very different from that myth. According to documents that Brightmark itself filed with US EPA, 90% of what comes out of its pyrolysis facility is plastic-derived fuel. Most of that fuel is burned on site at Brightmark. Some of it is shipped elsewhere to be burned. The remaining 10% is toxic char that's landfilled. So everything that comes out of that Brightmark facility is either fuel that's burned or char that's landfilled. Burning plastic-derived fuel is not recycling. Landfilling char is not recycling. It's not climate friendly. It's not safe. It's not green. It's not advanced. Again, the reality of what's happening here is very, very different. This is a plastic to fuel facility that burns fuel and landfills char. That's it. The second facility that I'd like to highlight, also on that list of 6, is an Agilyx facility in Tigard, Oregon. Another facility that's often held up as one of these gold standard facilities. Look at what we can do with this futuristic process. What the industry says that Agilyx does is that it brings in polystyrene foam. Polystyrene foam is commonly known as styrofoam. It's what a lot of our food packaging is made out of. A lot of hot beverage containers are made out of. The Agilyx facility says that they take in polystyrene foam, they use pyrolysis to break it down into styrene, which again is a monomer, a building block of polystyrene. So Agilyx says that they bring in polystyrene foam, break it into styrene, which can then be used to create more polystyrene foam. This again is that myth of closing the loop. Look, there's no waste plastic, because we bring in this polystyrene foam, we turn it into styrene, and then that styrene's turned back into polystyrene. This is, again, is the fictional closed loop. The reality, again, is very different. The data here, again, is from Agilyx's own filings with EPA. So Agilyx is creating styrene using pyrolysis, and according to their filings with EPA, more than 99.9% of that styrene is shipped off-site to be burned. This is plastic to fuel. This is incinerating plastic in 2 steps. This isn't recycling. This isn't closing the loop. And the problem with both of these facilities and all of the rest of the facilities that are effectively plastic to fuel operations is that burning plastic and burning plastic-derived fuel is toxic and climate damaging. There's no way around it. The emissions from the pyrolysis processes themselves, and especially the emissions from burning plastic-derived fuel, include toxics like benzene, toluene, dioxins, heavy metals, and nitrogen oxides, chemicals that cause cancer and damage our nervous systems and our lungs and other internal organs. Burning plastic and burning plastic-derived fuels is also climate damaging. Plastics at the end of the day are derived from fossil fuels. When you take those plastics, break them down into a fuel, and then burn that fuel, you're doing the same thing as burning a fossil fuel. You're just mixing in all these additional toxic additives on top of it. It's toxic, it's climate damaging. Again, it's not recycling. Now, on top of all of that, an additional concern around advanced recycling, and again, around the myths in this lobbying campaign that's behind the push for advanced recycling, is the fact that unlike what we're often told from the industry, so-called advanced recycling offers no help for struggling recycling systems. Many of you on this call today understand very well that we're in a bit of a recycling crisis. Costs for recycling in towns and cities in Connecticut and throughout the Northeast and the country have soared. We have seen a significant drop in the markets for plastics collected through recycling. And so often industry proponents will come in and say, well, advanced recycling is the solution here. But it's just not. Because first of all, these facilities don't do anything to improve collection or sorting. Those are too big and too expensive steps in the recycling process. We've got to get all this stuff from the bins. We've got to sort it into its constituent components. Advanced recycling doesn't do anything to help that. These high heat facilities, they don't sort, they don't collect. But more importantly, these high heat pyrolysis facilities cannot be used on mixed plastic packaging or other household plastic waste. One of the problems here is that much of what's in our household plastic waste is number 1 and number 3 plastic. And those plastics in particular are often corrosive when they're used in these limited oxygen pyrolysis processes. So number 1 and number 3 plastics actually destroy pyrolysis equipment in a lot of instances. So they just can't take in this mixed household plastic waste. And these large facilities, every single facility that was on that list of 6 that I showed earlier, all of these facilities focus on post-industrial plastic waste, not household waste. Nexus, which is one of the companies that's operating one of these 6 facilities, Amcor, which is a plastic manufacturer, Honeywell, which is a plastics manufacturer. All of these companies have admitted that so-called advanced recycling is not a solution for mixed plastic waste from our households. So anytime we're being told that this is part of the answer to our recycling crisis, the crisis that's raising costs for towns and cities and residents, it's just not true. So then again, what's the point here? What's the point of advanced recycling? And as I mentioned earlier, it's a smokescreen. It's industry PR. The purpose here, and we'll get into this as I discuss some of the legislation that's being pushed by the industry, the purpose here is to keep us hooked on plastics so that the petrochemical industry can continue padding its collective wallets at the expense of our environment, at the expense of our wallets, at the expense of public health, and at the expense of the climate. The packaging industry and the petrochemical industry want to use this as a shiny ball, as a dodge to escape the real plastics reduction reforms that will help us out of our waste and plastics crises. So turning to the industry lobbying campaign for advanced recycling, it's really important here to kind of drill down on who's pushing for these advanced recycling technologies and how are they doing it, because the how is part of the problem here. It's a significant part of the problem. And there are really 2 steps in this industry lobbying campaign. And step 1, we've already touched quite a bit on. It's this greenwashing campaign. And this greenwashing is aimed at legislators. It's aimed at agency folks. It's aimed at governors and the public, selling this myth of what advanced recycling can do. And then after that greenwashing groundwork has been laid, industry proponents are trying to push, in particular, two really problematic pieces of legislation or additions to existing pieces of legislation. The first of these are bills that, as I put it, deregulate so-called advanced recycling facilities. What these bills do is reclassifies advanced recycling as manufacturing rather than waste facilities. And when you classify these facilities as manufacturing, it makes it easier to build and operate them without the same oversight protections or public input that come with waste facilities. Basically, it serves to disenfranchise people who live near these facilities. If you can't provide public input, if you don't have insight into reports and inspections or other guidelines, it's hard for you to know what's being built near you, and it's hard for you to object. That's disenfranchisement. The other type of problematic legislation at stake here are bills that count so-called advanced recycling or other high heat technologies as recycling. This often comes in the form of problematic extended producer responsibility for packaging bills, which I'll get into in a minute. But what these do is they weaken real packaging reforms, and they help subsidize this advanced recycling industry. And much of this is being pushed by the American Chemistry Council, which is a large lobbying group that represents the petrochemical industry. The American Chemistry Council has not been shy about the fact that pushing for those deregulatory laws that I mentioned is one of their top priorities, if not their number one top priority. And they have spent money accordingly. The figures I have up here show that from the start of the year 2021, the American Chemistry Council has spent more than $440,000 lobbying in Connecticut. They spent $130,000 lobbying in Rhode Island and almost $800,000 lobbying in New York. Much of that in pursuit of these laws that deregulate advanced recycling. At the same time, they've been pushing the types of ads that I have clipped onto this slide here, where again, they're selling the public, they're selling legislators on this myth of what advanced recycling can supposedly do. And they've had success. They've had really, really problematic success. Thus far, the American Chemistry Council has successfully seen this type of deregulatory law signed into law in 20 states across the country. And again, the problem with these laws is that they reclassify advanced recycling facilities as manufacturing. And manufacturing facilities are not subject to the same siting restrictions, operating conditions, public permitting processes, reporting requirements, or closure plan requirements as waste facilities. They're looking for loopholes, they're looking for carve-outs, they're looking to make it easier to build and operate these facilities essentially under the cover of darkness. Which begs the question, of course, if advanced recycling is green, if it's safe, if it's the answer to our plastic problem, why do they need to do this under the cover of darkness? Why do they need to deregulate these facilities if they're as safe and as green as they maintain? It just doesn't make sense. Because they're not. Because as we've seen, the reality of these facilities is that they're plastic to fuel operations. And so it's a lot easier for the industry to do this undercover. And of course, the second type of problematic legislation that I mentioned is the type of loopholes that count so-called advanced recycling as recycling. And this often comes as a part of extended producer responsibility, or EPR, bills and laws. EPR for packaging can be a real help for our plastics crisis if it's done right. A progressive modern EPR for packaging law will require the packaging industry to reduce their total amount of packaging, meet really stringent recycling targets, and pivot to reusable packaging. But the packaging industry and the petrochemical industry like to see loopholes inserted into these bills that count advanced recycling for the purposes of meeting those recycling targets. And the problem here is that effectively subsidizes the advanced recycling industry. When you make it easier for folks to meet their recycling targets by just shipping plastic waste off to these advanced recycling facilities to be turned into fuel that's then burned, you're creating a market for these facilities. a built-in market. They have customers waiting because they have packaging manufacturers who need to meet recycling targets and can do so by selling them their plastic waste. That's a built-in market, and that's a problem. That's a subsidy to the industry. The other real problem here is that if you make it easy for packaging manufacturers to just send their waste to an advanced recycler without having to meaningfully change their packaging, then they've got no incentive to reduce their packaging. They've got no incentive to pivot to reuse. They're just stuck in the same old business as usual. They send their plastic off to be burned, and we're not really making any progress towards reducing the amount of single-use plastic in our lives, which is really what the goal needs to be here. And these are not theoretical concerns. We saw both of these pieces of problematic legislation in the Connecticut General Assembly in the year 2022. Bill SB 352 was that American Chemistry Council backed bill that would have deregulated advanced recycling. And SB 115 was an EPR for packaging bill that was backed by both the packaging industry and Connecticut Deep, that contained that loophole whereby companies could meet recycling targets through advanced recycling, which again is just a subsidy to the advanced recycling industry. And on top of all of that, and I apologize for the litany of gloom and doom here, but advanced recycling poses a significant environmental injustice concern. As Anne mentioned, as she kicked off our meeting here today, waste and injustice have gone hand in hand for far too long in Connecticut. Whiter, wealthier communities throughout the state have sent their trash to incinerators in Hartford and Bridgeport to be burned in low-income communities and communities of color. The problem is that the petrochemical industry is taking a page from that same incinerator playbook as they try to push for so-called advanced recycling technologies. This industry campaign that I just mentioned involves those deregulatory laws. It involves loopholes and subsidies. These things, deregulation, loopholes, and subsidies, have propped up these aging waste incinerators in Connecticut for decades. And now they want to do the same thing with advanced recycling facilities. That's a problem. Those deregulatory laws also disenfranchise communities, as I mentioned. And on top of all of that, the industry is intentionally targeting communities of color and low-income communities as sites for these facilities, just like the incineration industry did so many decades ago. At the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, deregulating these processes, these facilities, means no public process. It means fewer reports and inspections. It means less oversight and fewer siting restrictions. That collectively suppresses and oppresses the communities forced to live near these facilities because they don't have input, they don't have insight into what's going on. And these loopholes and subsidies, they serve to enrich and empower wealthy corporations, the petrochemical industry that's profiting off of plastics manufacturing and plastics disposal. And all of this, again, at the expense of the folks who are forced to live near these types of facilities. And once again, this isn't theoretical. We can see the way that it's playing out in practice. In 2021, US EPA published a list of 40 gasification and pyrolysis plants that are both operational and many of which are planned or in process. Half of this list of 40 are in states that have already passed these deregulatory laws that I mentioned. And more than half of these facilities are in or near communities of color and low-income communities. The same patterns that we saw with incinerators, that we see with incinerators, playing out again with these new, basically two-step plastic incineration facilities. And I'd like to highlight one more example from that list of 6 facilities that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. This time I'd like to pivot to Nexus Circular, formerly known as Nexus Fuels, which is located in Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia is a state that passed that so-called advanced recycling deregulatory bill back in 2018. And then you see Nexus Fuels, now Nexus Circular, pop up and start using a pyrolysis process to convert industrial plastic waste into so-called chemical field feedstocks in Western Atlanta. So to break that down a bit further, you have a facility in Western Atlanta, which is located in a community that is predominantly a community of color and predominantly a low-income community, bringing in waste from industrial sources from outside the community. This is not plastic waste generated by the people that live there. This is plastic waste generated by corporations shipping it to Nexus Circular. And then Nexus Circular is using a toxic process to break those plastics down into chemical feedstocks, quote unquote chemical feedstocks. Nexus is then shipping those chemical feedstocks to a Shell facility in Norco, Louisiana, where those feedstocks end up being burned by Shell in Norco, which again is predominantly a community of color and a low-income community. And this Shell facility in particular in Norco, Louisiana, has a long, long history of environmental violations and environmental injustices. So you see this two-step burning process playing out in two different locations, both of which are environmental justice communities. This is the process playing out again and again and again. Lather, rinse, repeat. The industry is disenfranchising communities and subjecting them to the greatest level of harm. So with all of that, how do we push back? And the answer on how we push back is much more similar than all of the ins and outs and problems with advanced recycling, because the answer is really outreach, outreach, outreach. Call your legislators, email your legislators, urge them to oppose any and all efforts to either deregulate or support or subsidize or endorse advanced recycling or chemical recycling. Tell them to oppose any extended producer responsibility bill that includes any type of loophole for advanced recycling that would only serve to subsidize the advanced recycling industry. And urge your legislators to support the real common sense plastic restrictions that are the actual answer right here. As I mentioned earlier, plastics are a problem. Making plastics is a problem. Using single-use plastics is a problem, and disposing of single-use plastics is a problem. We can't address those problems unless we stop making so many single-use plastics. That's the answer. Good, strong, extended producer responsibility bills without loopholes. Single-use plastic bans, styrofoam bans, all of those types of things can help pave the way toward the reuse and plastic-free future that we need. Buying into petrochemical industry nonsense that only keeps us hooked on the cycle of making and destroying plastics is never going to be the answer. The more we do to reach out to legislators to get them on board with the right solutions and get them to oppose the bad solutions, the more we get to the right future. Again, if there is no plastic waste, then there's no plastic waste to burn, and we don't have to worry about these false solutions anymore. And with that, thank you so much for having me here today. I know that that was a lot. I'm really looking forward to discussing any questions that you might have. And my contact information is up here on this slide. So you can always reach out after our conversation today if you have any additional questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really great. There is a question in the chat that was first, and then we'll get to Representative Mashinsky and James Albus. Welcome. A question from Fran Brady, CT Recyclers Coalition and Bring Your Own Madison is the amount of CO2 and toxic byproducts produced in advanced recycling less than is produced in virgin petrochemical or bio-based plastic manufacturing process, assuming the same scale?
So thanks, Fran. That's a great question. So again, this is where we see a distinct difference between the theory of so-called advanced recycling and the practice. So the petrochemical industry will often say that that you are producing less CO2 and fewer toxic byproducts in an advanced recycling process because you're skipping you allegedly are skipping the extraction phase. If you're breaking down plastics to turn them into new plastics, then supposedly you're generating fewer toxics than if you're extracting fossil fuels to create those plastics. But that's not the reality, and it won't ever be the reality, because these facilities in practice are breaking plastic into fuel and then burning that fuel, which generates far more toxics, especially when you take a look at the whole journey of the plastics life cycle up to that point. It's still a one-way street. It's not a closed loop, and you end up burning plastic, which is toxic and climate damaging. So if you look at the real facilities and the process as a whole ending in the destruction of all the products that come out of these pyrolysis facilities, the impact is much greater. And again, there's no real recycling happening. So you're not doing anything to interrupt the toxic cycle of making new plastics.
Thank you. Representative Mashinsky.
Hi there. I wanted to ask you if you would separate out the actual recycling of plastics that is happening from your presentation. Because I think when you depolymerize, which I think is the process for the PET bottles when they're made into fleece, we have millions of them in Connecticut, if not billions, of PET bottles, and they go, because we're a deposit state, and they go out of state. They are, I believe, depolymerized before they're turned into fleece, and then they come back as a LL Bean jacket or something like that. So I assume you don't have an objection to that as actual recycling. I hope, because I would like our state to continue to have the bottle bill and to send the PET bottles to be made into something else. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I would be happy to. Thank you for asking that clarifying question, because to be clear, that I absolutely do not object to that process, and Just Zero doesn't. The bottle bill in Connecticut and in other states with bottle bills is one of the few real success stories around recycling. Plastic bottles that go through bottle bill programs are far more likely to be actually recycled than any other process. And all of these bottle bill programs are using conventional recycling methods, mechanically breaking down that plastic to turn it into new products that does not incorporate any of these high heat technologies, doesn't incorporate so-called advanced recycling, isn't anywhere near as toxic or climate damaging. So, the bottle bill and recycling plastic through a bottle bill is a real solution. Advanced recycling is not.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. James?
Thank you, Anne. Kevin, thank you so much for your presentation today. James Albus from Connecticut DEEP. I had one comment and one question. First of all, I want to make sure that folks don't take away a mischaracterized understanding of DEEP's position on Senate Bill 115 and how it relates to chemical recycling. I think, first and foremost, we are most concerned with circularity at DEEP. We want to see plastic, glass, metal products being made into new plastic, glass, and metal products. We want to see a plastic beverage container getting recycled and getting turned back into another plastic beverage container. And I think our feeling was that was how the language in Senate Bill 115 was written, that only plastics to plastics would count as recycling. So I want to be very clear that that is DEEP's position. We do not believe that burning plastics for fuel is acceptable and should absolutely not be counted as recycling. So I just want to be very clear about that. And if there are ways so we could talk about adjusting that language, I think we're open to having some discussion on how to phrase it the way I think it sounds like we both agree on. So my question, Kevin, is, there have been now 4 other states that have passed packaging EPR bills. Maine was the first, and it probably has the least amount of detail in its law, but the other 3 states, Colorado, California, Oregon, have all passed some pretty detailed packaging EPR bills. So just wondering what your perspective is on those bills, especially as how they relate to plastics recycling.
Thank you, James, both for the clarification around DEEP's position and the question. Getting first to your clarification. I think it's great that we are on the same page with respect to, plastic fuel and plastic incineration not being the solution. I think that language that does as much as possible to be clear that that is not a loophole, that that doesn't count as recycling is essential in an EPR bill. Now, when it comes to the EPR bills that have been passed by other states, EPR is an evolving landscape. And Maine and Oregon's bills are a little simpler and more straightforward than what was passed in Colorado and California. And I think that some progress has been made throughout that journey, that path forward on EPR. I think that California in particular, which is the most recent law to be passed for extended producer responsibility for packaging, does a lot of good things. Just Zero still has some concerns around around a potential place for so-called advanced recycling and so-called chemical recycling in the California bill. I know that there are others that disagree, but the California bill is largely silent around technologies like advanced recycling and chemical recycling, which maybe isn't a loophole, but it's an opening. And we see that as a problem, given how hard the packaging industry and the petrochemical industry are pushing on so-called advanced recycling and chemical recycling. We think that a version of the California bill that explicitly calls out these technologies as being kind of unacceptable and not a part of meeting recycling targets, so on and so forth, is the best possible route forward. So sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but short answer is that progress is being made throughout these EPR bills, and we think there's room for more progress, especially when it comes to closing any potential openings for problematic plastic to fuel technology.
Thank you. Do we have some other questions? I know there was maybe something else in the chat from Fran. So the one was, is there data to support your answer to Fran's question about the virgin petrochemical versus the advanced recycling?
So there's some data. One of the problems with many of these facilities and operating in states that have passed these deregulatory laws is that there is less data available from these facilities than otherwise might be available, which is a problem. It's hard to track actually what's going on at these facilities and the emissions from these facilities. But we do have some data, especially when it comes to some of the types of things that I included in my presentation about destinations for the products that come out of these facilities and the types of emissions associated with those, with the processes that end up burning some of these toxic waste products and plastic derived fuel. So we have a part of that picture. Given the push for deregulation, we're somewhat limited. But I think that there's enough to illustrate the fact that overall, these processes make the problem worse. They don't improve our plastic pollution problem.
Thank you, Kevin. Susan, you got your hand up?
I sure do. Thank you. James, I was looking at the website for CCSMM and reviewing the slides from the Ocean Conservancy presentation, which was really excellent presentation that you guys put on in the EPR working group late August. So that was really great. Thank you for doing that. And I just wanted to ask, because on there you had posted some deep views on chemical recycling. One of the things you said that you don't support a complete ban on chemical recycling. So I was wondering what would be allowable, if you had a ban that wasn't complete, what would be reliable?
And do you mind if I answer that question?
Allowable, I'm sorry, not reliable.
Sure. So I think from Dee's perspective, we'd like to keep a door open for a potential technology, as Kevin kind of outlined. The reality on the ground just doesn't support the ability to make plastic into plastic now. And Kevin also noted, at lab scale, there is some research going into that potential. I think we want to see if those technologies do pan out. We want to leave a door open so that if, for example, you are able to create a process where you can take post-consumer plastic, break it down into its base components, and then use that to make it into new plastic. So you are displacing the need to create virgin plastic material. That is something that we would like to be able to evaluate. And if it doesn't create environmental harm, if it doesn't create danger to public health, it's something that we want to be able to consider as acceptable when it comes to counting as recycling. So that was what that statement meant.
Great. One more, if you don't mind. You also said that you would consider your position that it would be that chemical recycling was not an alternative to appropriate bans on single-use plastics. So I was wondering what you would consider appropriate bans so that we can support those as well, hopefully, and if you're going to be proposing them this legislative session.
Sure, I think appropriate bans are along the lines of what we've seen recently in the legislature, including styrofoam containers for takeout food, for example, straws, other types of single-use plastic materials that are difficult to recycle or not able to be recycled currently. Those are the types of things that I think we were envisioning with that statement. And DEEP has been supportive of those efforts in the past in the legislature. So it's something that we would continue to support.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. There's a couple questions in the chat too.
Sorry, Anne, if I might just respond really
Sure,
quickly.
of course.
So with respect to what James said around leaving the door open, one of the concerns that Just Zero has about so-called leaving the door open is that the petrochemical industry has been at this for about 70 years now. Gasification, pyrolysis, other types of depolymerization technologies were first explored in the 1950s. And in those 70 years, they haven't made any progress at a real industrial scale toward closing the loop on plastics. My organization thinks that it is better to be clear and disallow the types of technologies that we know are problematic on the ground right now. And if there are advances in the future, which seems unlikely given the track record, but if there are advances in the future, come back and amend the legislation. Once the plastics industry has something to show for themselves, which again seems unlikely given the way that plastics are produced and the way these processes work, then they can come back when they have something to show that really works. But we've got ample evidence right now that this is a problem, so let's act on that evidence. And when the plastics industry can prove otherwise, they can try to get a law amended.
Great, thank you. Barbara had a question in the chat. Is there a parallel type of greenwashing in the paper industry councils that claim they pull out gable-topped containers or aseptic cartons from MFRs and can separate the different materials?
Well, that's a tough question, and I don't think that I have an answer for you, Barbara. I wish that I did. So I will say generally, concerns around gable-topped containers and aseptic cartons is that it combines more than one type of material. Most of these materials are paper that are lined with plastic. And there's a lot of evidence out there that that is a really, really hard omelet to unscramble, if you will. I might have mixed metaphors there. I apologize for that. But it's hard. Anytime you have two materials combined, it's really, really hard to recycle those materials. And so I am not super familiar with all of the potential greenwashing around these materials that's out there, but I will say that any type of combined material like that does not have a great track record when it comes to recycling, and it's likely problematic.
Thank you. Another question in the chat from Ian McDonald. Do you have any insights into industry AstroTurf campaigns in support of chemical/advanced recycling bills?
Yes, so, Ian, I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume that you're using AstroTurf in the metaphorical sense, which is when you have large industry-sponsored campaigns posing as grassroots organizations. That's where the metaphor of AstroTurf comes from. It's fake grass. So in these types of campaigns, you have industry posing as a community group. And yes, there is a lot of that when it comes to any type of petrochemical industry campaign, in particular advanced recycling. In my slides, when I was talking about industry lobbying, I had an example of a Facebook ad that was run by the American Chemistry Council. They sponsor and pay for a lot of similar ads that don't say American Chemistry Council on them, but list groups. I'm not going to come up with exactly the right name, but it's like Consumers for Choice and things like that. A lot of so they're not identified as being American Chemistry Council campaigns, and they have these like rosy names about like, well, people want to have the opportunity to use single-use plastic, so on and so forth. There's a lot of that out there, and it's difficult to parse through it all because people will hear things, people will see things, people will see ads on social media that seem like they're from folks coming from the same place as they are, and they're not. I'd also mention that the petrochemical industry really likes to co-opt the same type of language that many of us have been using around problems with the recycling system, around failures with plastics recycling, because it is true that only about 6% of our plastics are recycled. So the petrochemical industry likes to swoop in through AstroTurf campaigns and say, hey, only 6% of our plastics are recycled. We need the right solution. And then they say that the right solution is so-called advanced recycling when it really isn't. So there's just a lot of insidious techniques, strategies, and misinformation out there that's just hard to parse through, and it's a challenge. The need to stay vigilant. It's exhausting.
This is true. Edith has a question in the chat. Are any regulation on the federal level that you like, for example, the IRA bill?
So there isn't any new federal regulation around these types of high heat technologies that I like. That seems to be a move in the right direction. Right now, gasification and pyrolysis are regulated as incineration under the Federal Clean Air Act, which is the way it should stay. Because as I highlighted in my presentation, gasification and pyrolysis of plastics are essentially incineration split into two parts. Unsurprisingly, the American Chemistry Council and other petrochemical industry lobbyists are trying to change that. They have been engaged in a lengthy campaign with US EPA, trying to convince EPA to change the Clean Air Act regulations to exempt gasification and pyrolysis facilities from the same rules that apply to incinerators. And I'd note that those rules that apply to incinerators are already not stringent enough. And yet the petrochemical industry wants to exempt these essentially incineration facilities from already too weak regulations, and that's a problem. So we're significantly concerned about it actually moving in the opposite direction, about getting rid of the already insufficient regulations around these facilities.
Thank you. And thank you, James. You answered Doug's question in the chat. Doug, is that sufficient? Diane has a question, and then we'll wrap. It's at 1 o'clock, and then we'll wrap up. Can CTD assist the recycling facilities to get black plastic sorting technology faster via regulation, low interest loans, etc.? It's a question for Deep.
That's easier said than done. I would say there are some legislators on the call here. So if you would support providing more money to our department, that is certainly something that we could do with resources. I will also note that the Connecticut Green Bank, as you probably recall, has an expanded scope that includes waste and recycling facilities due to recent legislation that passed. So they are currently kind of investigating how best to incorporate that into their scope of work and their business model. So it's possible that these types of technology improvements could be something that they are able to provide some low interest loan assistance with. But just a couple thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. All right, it's 1 o'clock, 1:01. I want to, in the interest of, respecting everybody's time, thank you to our presenters. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Thank you to everybody for being here. This is being recorded. I will send it out to everybody that attended, and please feel free to share it with whoever you think, would be interested in this topic, whoever needs some additional information. You can always reach out to myself. You can always reach out to Kevin. Sharon Lewis is always up to be talking about environmental justice in Connecticut. And I just wanted to end with, we have long used solutions to waste, to energy, that are unsustainable and inequitable and basically unfair. So we really have a chance now with some new solutions to these problems that can work for everybody in our new green, clean economy of the future. We can create a world that really works for everybody. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a great day.